Chapter 7. The game was over. There were 3 moves. He would win again. Soto knew it all too well. Pawn takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Bishop mates king. I saw no other way. And he waited for me to make my move. But I made him wait longer. I did so because of all the pain he had caused the world. There wasn't an ounce of sympathy I had left for him. He remained a ghost. His spirit died a long time ago, and it was replaced by the spirit of the damned. Nothing could be resolved or forgiven, though what made it worse was knowing I was guilty of the pain too. I was involved. I took part of the madness, and I caused much pain to all these people of this great mysterious land. I took part in the madness and the evil, though I had not known it at the time, because I too was lost in that dream. And I was convinced that it meant everything in the world. But Soto was still lost. He was lost in the dream that died so long ago. His focus was not on the present, it was of the future, what he was about to conquer, what he was about to hold. He made his deal with the devil, just like Pizarro, just like Coronado. He said his words, but I hardly listened. They say it's near the river Sardina, towards the river's end. They say we'll find it. That's why Coronado failed. He didn't go deep enough. But we will. Mark my words, we will. He went on. Join us, Sardina. We need you. We've come just in time. Redemption. Redemption. There'll be no other games to win, Sardina. He went on. I could no longer look him in the eye. I couldn't believe it either, Sardina. I still can't in some regard. But we're close. We're very close. You came just in time. Just like in Peru. I know it only seems, but you remember Peru, don't you? You remember the gold, how it made us kings. How could you forget? You must join us. But in that instant, it came to me. 3 moves would beat him. The moves were strung together by some miracle, but they were there all along. They came to me full and whole and clear. And I found a way. I made the first move, knight to his empty queen. Soto smiled, and he shook his head. Strange move, but I've seen stranger. You're a good man. But this is not your game, Sardina. It never was. You shouldn't feel ashamed. He countered quickly. I did as well. Bishop to king. And he took my queen with no hesitation. Then he unfolded his hands, tilted his head, and looked me straight in the face. And in a deep and mangled voice, he repeated his plea of madness. I'm going to ask you one more time, Sardina. Will you join me or not? I shook my head and returned his stare. And as I did, I made my final move, and I removed my hand. No, I said. And the game was over. Soto moved his king in all the possible moves one could make, but none of it made any difference. He had lost. I had no feeling, nor did Soto. He took his king and laid it to his side. He stared at me, deeper and deeper, and he tried to take my soul. Then Soto cleared the board with one smack, and the pieces flew into the air. He drew the board to the flame, and he yelled into oblivion. He screamed long and hard, and he cried like a child. He was only a man. He panted and exhaled, and again the silence returned. Then I stood up and said what I wanted to say for all that time. No, Soto. I will not join you. It's over. Then I turned my back, headed for the darkness, and walked away. But Soto persisted. He chased me through the woods. He was probably only 100 yards away, but I kept moving. Sardina! I heard his steel rust as he slashed his sword to and fro. His hollers and shouts pierced like cannon fire. It is not over! This is why you are poor! Come back, Sardina! Play me again! I'll beat you! I'll beat you with 4 pieces! I saw him stagger and heard him race through the dark. But I kept on moving. Sardina! I turned and looked at his face for the final time. And that was the last I saw of him. And throughout the night, I moved and followed the moonlight. I heard the men's voices. I heard their screams and their grunts, but I was beyond them. I had passed the fear. It took me my entire life, but I felt it in every way. I was buried underneath that fear for the longest time, but I knew I had passed it. I could not bear to live that life again. It wasn't real. Being a part of that world, being a conquistador, meant destroying the land you walked upon, owning it, and denying all the rest. It meant living totally within the mind. And I knew I could not live that life anymore. In the morning, I thought of many things. I took off my armor, but I kept my sword. I searched for the river with the remaining hours of sunlight. But the further I went, the more strange the land had become. Many times, I found hollowed-out gray trees filled with chunks of ice and mountain snow. I trekked beyond a green hill of jagged, dense rocks. But the further I went, the more my mind crawled back. I fell into a walking dream and imagined Soto speaking to his men before their last crusade. Those bastards. Those soulless souls. I knew them because I was one of them, and I felt the utmost pity. And in my mind, I heard Soto's preposterous speech, and I could see the sweat and blood of every man who heard his evil, empty words. He would march them to their deaths. And the next morning, Soto's men gathered. All 200 of them stood and listened. The survivors, the tired, the mad, the battered, and the wounded. They all stood for one reason, It was a horrible and obligatory one. They wanted to hear their leader for what many hoped was for the final time. And Soto spoke once again. Abandon what you think. We will see to the river's end all that is our kingdom. Our kingdom. No one else's. Remember why we came. Remember the days in the fields. We did not come here to suffer gladly. We came to conquer. And conquer we shall. In Peru, we've conquered because the Incas bled. So it will be the same. They will all bleed. He slit his finger and watched the blood drip down to the ground. Then he shouted and waved the finger so every man could see. You see this blood? The blood of the everlasting covenant? It is our blood in our land. These savages think it's theirs. It is not. It will never be. This river is stained with blood. We will follow this river down. This entrada will go on until we find our kingdom. We will march. We will march! And so they did. Soto steadily rides on with Ortiz. Moscoso rides not far behind. Vicente, some 3 miles west with his unit, carries through. He looks to the sky and dares it to rain. The army marches on. They know little about their direction. They know less of what is ahead. Autumn days pass. The men grow weary. The march goes on. Days grow shorter. Winter arrives. The cold settles with raw winds. The march goes on. Rankhouse studies what he has written with his shivering hands. The paper reads, December 1st, day 542. Clumps of snow smear the page. Rankle's eyes do not waver. Elvas writes as well, but not as much. He watches rain turn back to snow. Soto rides on. Moscoso again rides close behind. Balthasar and the others remain furlongs away. The next day comes. The march goes on. It might be Christmas, it might not. Only the priests seemed to know for sure, but they were clearly as doubtful as anyone else. All I remembered about that day was the Mass was held and that our prayers were never answered. We reached another river, and the ice had formed and covered the land. We searched for the remaining 3 days, and all that time we came across no village. We came upon another river the natives called the Mississippi, and we pressed on. It was a bitterly cold day, and it snowed for much of it, and the mud-soaked land turned white for miles. The rain, the heat, the cold, the constant marching. How long can one endure? No one wants to say it, but all see it. All see it every day. Don Hernando has lost his mind. I simply cannot write anymore. And at this point, I, nor anybody, knows what to do. All I wanted to see was the river. All I wanted to do was see its end. I walked for many days, alone, and burdened. South was my only direction. It got colder. The land did not change. The rocks seemed the same. The sand seemed heavier. The sun, although bright, faded slow and cruel, and for a long, hard, and horrible day, I thought I had returned to the desert. But in reality, it was about to snow. I rested by a set of shrubs and watched the sky grow purple and black. The night came. I found it impossible to sleep. I smelled the smoke. Soto and his men were only miles away, probably only 5. In the silence, my thoughts emerged. The thoughts of my horrible past, and each memory and thought struck my head like pings of pelting rain. In my sack, I emptied all that I had carried. I held a chess piece, a white knight, and I stared at it for hours. And when I saw Soto's face reflected in the cracks, I held the piece to the flame and watched it burn. The next day I pressed on, one step forward, then another, one step at a time. Then I saw it. It was the largest river I had ever seen. It was deep and wide, and it looked just like it did in my dreams. I went in and soaked my entire body. And for that brief moment, I cried and felt the touch of God. And I knew it was right. I knew it was pure. It was true and beautiful. And in that river, everything made sense again. I saw many things, not just memories, but real things. I saw Manco and the Turk. I saw the spirits of the Corazons, the people of Tiji, and all the rest. All those who tried to make me see. They were all there for me. All had gathered, and they all confirmed. But then I saw her, the woman, the native woman I saw before I reached Soto. It seemed like years ago. I found her by the brook. She sobbed and stared into space. She was all alone. Dirt covered her face, but her eyes were deep and soft. Her skin was brown, and her hair was black and curled, and it danced in the wind. She covered her arms and shivered. I heard her cry and whimper and tremble, and I could see all her pain. We stared at each other again, and in that second, it was just as the first time I had seen her. And I realized she, like the river, was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in my life. But when I tried to smile, it was not returned. She turned back and ran, and I watched her disappear into the woods. And for the rest of the day, she was all that I thought about. The next day, I let the river guide me. My heart was filled, but it still ached. And for the next 100 days, I followed that river, and I vowed not to stop until I reached its end. Whatever I was searching for, whatever I had forgotten, I knew I would find it there. Then I thought of Soto and his men. It was impossible to stop them. I could only warn the Indians of their arrival. I knew these people would fight with all they had to protect their lands. I knew they would do whatever it took, and I knew they would do so with utmost bravery. and I took it as my mission to warn them of Soto any chance I could. But that too was an arduous task. I had no translators, and each time I tried, I knew they did not understand me. Each tribe I spoke to, I felt very much like the Turk, a strange man with a strange tale who was only warning the inevitable. And on those nights, I felt cold and damp, and I stared up at the moon. I thought about all the blood, all the pain, all which would be forgotten. And each night, I awoke in the darkness and screamed. Then I washed my face in the river and smelled the blood that was forever stained on my hands. And I knew Soto wasn't far. And Sardina was right. The entrada was a mere 10 miles from where he stood. Soto's army reached the very same river, the Mississippi. And throughout the cold and damp January, his men marched. West and south of the river, the Spanish found the various kingdoms of Cochoya and Quictoraltum. They found another set of villages of the Pacha and Aquacho tribe that were large and dense in population. All of these kingdoms were warned beforehand of Soto's arrival, but none took any heed to these warnings. And each time, Soto repeated his madness. He held his bloody sword and asked for the chiefs of the land to be summoned to him. And when the chief was brought forth, Soto asked for gold. And when Soto was denied, he decapitated each chief, so all could see. And his men took in more slaves and women, and they slaughtered the rest. And their march of death continued. Rankel wrote again in his journal. He overlooked the frozen solid river with Moscoso. He made his daily count. He lowered his head and sighed. Many more days passed. There were gray skies with no sun. And as the days passed, the army suffered painful and unbearable hunger. "Sir, may I have a word with you?" "What is it, Rankel?" said Moscoso. "The rations, we're—" "I know," said Moscoso. "I've heard. We'll have to make do." "I don't see how we can, sir. We've lost too many servants. We just don't have enough food." "We found it before. We'll just have to find it again." And with that look, the look of incredulity and prosperous faith, Moscoso departed. Soto sat by Ortiz in the dying light. They spoke and rambled. The blind man and the madman. Their voices cracked and strained. "Beyond the south, there are lands of plenty. Where are we, Juan? Another child without his... Where are we, Juan? Lands of plenty. Food and land." Ortiz stripped his head and fell to slumber. Soto continued to listen to the villagers. And when he had enough, he took a knife and slit a man's throat. Then he walked away and went alone. And in the dark, Soto remained alone. He talked to himself and the universe. He shouted and cried. His dreams and reality were woven into each other. They were seamlessly welded together and indistinguishable. And his madness continued well into the night stars. He spoke his words aloud with drunken conviction. Beyond. Beyond. His servants trudged back and forth. The rest of the men stayed back and watched. Flag! Where is the flag? Give me the fucking flag! The servants brought the encrusted stained flag of Spain to Soto, and he clutched it to his bosom as if it were his child. And as Soto spoke, all of his men stared, and the madness engulfed. My special friend, Holy Spain, I shall never return. Images floated through his mind. He saw familiar souls. He saw Coronado, Núñez, and Sardina. The images stood like statues. He spat in disgust and waved his sword. And Soto approached each one. All this blood, all these rivers. But where are the fruits? Where are our fruits of victory? His army stood and stared. They cringed and sighed and shook their heads, and Soto screamed only louder. They're deeper, deeper, and that's why you've all failed. You didn't go deep enough. You were all wrong. You bastards were all wrong. You quit too soon. You all be forgotten bastards because you haven't suffered enough. Núñez, I know why they call you Cabeza de Vaca. No one believes you because you are wrong. They are not people. They are mere savages. Savages! Coronado, I never met you in my life, but that doesn't matter. You will always be an idiot. But Sardina, you disappoint me the most. You make me so fucking sad. You could have had it all, man. You could have been a king! February ended. The Mississippi thawed. But still, the madness drew them forward. We build rafts, said Soto. So they did. One last hope. The land down south. And still, the river flowed. My body ached. My head was numb. I had no idea how much time had passed. Soto's men were right in front of me. I hid my view from them and stood behind a tree as I heard them shout and swear. I heard them grunt and slash, and I heard the cannon blast one after another. Then I saw their wooden rafts approach. Some dozen men crowded each one, and my eyes fixated on the face of one young soldier. He couldn't have been more than 18 years old. All the pain and all the sadness, I saw it all in that young man's face. He was young, but he looked so old. This old young man. His gray and dead eyes looked just like Soto's. He reminded me of myself before Catemaca, and he reminded me of that day on the beach with Francisco, the day I lost my soul. Another man cried out his name. Vicente! Vicente! The scream grew louder. Vicente! The young man responded, and when he did, I let go of my gaze, and I watched the raft disappear. The 3rd of March. Another day. Cold and brittle. Another village lies ahead. The army slays its residents and pillages for food. They take bushels of grain and dry corn, but they find nothing else. There is no caque, no chief, no ruler of any kind. Soto screams and hobbles. He gives the signal, and they torch it all asunder. I smelled smoke from the south, and it burned from morning to dusk. Black plumes of smoke filled the air. Then another hour passed, and I heard screams. They were screams from slaves. Most of them were still in chains. They ran down the hills and past me. I saw about 50 of them, men, women, and children, young and old, and all of them had an everlasting sadness in their eyes. The smoke clears at twilight. 5 miles away, 2 tribes emerge and form. They settle and negotiate. They plan accordingly. They sharpen their spears and arrows, and they pray to the moon and the tide. They pray for healing, and they pray for guidance in the coming days. They will fight the Spanish tomorrow. They will defend and attack and defy. And as the day drew, I saw something I never thought I would. A set of tribes stood their ground against Soto's army, and they simply did not surrender. They stood united and fought the entire day. They saw me, but they paid me no attention. They were waiting. They were ready and focused. They closed their eyes and prayed, and I understood. They blew in their fists. They screamed at the sun. And when the battle began, their eyes lit up in utmost defiance. And it reminded me of Manco and his brave Incas. And for that day, the tribe stood defiant and outfought Soto's army. They defended their lands and held their ground. The 1st of April. Rancal tries to finish his diary entry. The ink won't come out. His hands turn black. The gentleman of Alvas doesn't even try. His head throbs in pain. The army passes through once more. The river finally thaws. Sunlight returns, but only slightly. The army keeps marching. Soto rides on. His horse gives out and collapses. Both fall to the frozen ground. His men assist him. Soto calls them back. He bends over, takes out his sword, and slices the horse's throat. Blood runs down his hand. He presses his finger to the wound and gives it a taste. He gets back up. Horse! Immediately, another horse is brought to him. Soto mounts up. He says one word, and his men follow. Vamos! Snow turns back to rain. Soto looks at the river, lost in thought, lost in gaze. He speaks to himself. He answers back. Just like Peru. The 15th of April. Soto's eyes twitch in and out, demented, beaten, gone. Balthasar catches up with him. Soto ignores him and slips deeper into heavy dream. Don Hernando! Don Hernando, the men need to rest! 1 more week. There? No response. Soto dips his head up and down. The dream overtakes him. Don Hernando, do you hear me? Soto snaps back his head. The world comes back to him. He forms a sadistic grin. We come from Spain. We come from Holy Spain. Soto shows Balthazar his hand. His finger bleeds. Blood drips to the ground. He points to the river. This river, this is it. This is the one. Well known, Balthazar. Well known to you and me. Don Hernando, the men, they can't go on. We must. They can go on. They're half dead, sir. They're starving. Look at them. They can't go on. They can't possibly go on. Can't you see? Can't you see, Don Hernando? Just beyond. Just beyond. We're here. Soto now gives Infolides the endless gaze. His mouth hangs open. He grins. Sir! 1 more march. 1 more. To the river's end. We're there, Balthazar. The 29th of April. Rain pours. Soto leads his army down the river on 5 barges. He stands on the helm, his head still, his eyes bloodied. High tide. The currents whip left to right. The barges float like tiny corks. The men scream, trying to keep their balance and their hope. Several fall overboard. They make landfall. The slaves commiserate. They wail and curse. Soto grabs one of the slaves and strangles his neck. Ortiz! What are they saying, Ortiz? They're setting up an ambush, aren't they? Aren't they? Soto lets go and pierces the slave in the stomach. He turns to his men. Where are we? Where's Ortiz? The 1st of May. Soto approached the medic as the afternoon slipped to dusk. Inside the tent laid Ortiz. His face was pale and his body motionless. Soto stood by his side and asked his questions, and Ortiz babbled incoherently. They say you're dying, said Soto. That's by far the best news I've heard all day. You've been given your last rites, Ortiz. Eduardo is a good priest. Your prayers will be answered. Ortiz tried to raise his arm, but he simply didn't have the strength. Don't strain yourself. Words don't matter to you anymore. I doubt if they ever did. Don't make a spectacle out of it. You should have died many times, Juan. I'm surprised you lasted even this long. But for some reason, I trusted you. Only a madman trusts a blind man. And here we are. Ortiz hacked and coughed out blood. It spilled down his entire face. Soto looked away. No one ever listens. All they do is cough and die. If you're gonna die, Juan, please die quickly. We can't see you suffer. You've been a good man, Juan. But I must tell you the truth. I never liked you. And that's all I'll ever know for sure. When I first met you, I thought you were a gift from God. I really did, Ortiz. But ever since that day, it's become clearer and clearer what you really are. Ortiz's face remained blank, cold and gray, and he finally shut his eyes. You're a blind man. You're a blind fucking man. And we've been following you all this time. Took me 2 years to realize how blind you were and how blind we were. I should have known. But I fell in love with you. I fell in love with the idea of you. A savior. A guide. A wise man. You're none of these things. You never were. But this is my fault. It's all my fault. I followed you. I followed you down to hell and kept going. And I'm the fucking fool. Ortiz coughed and hacked again. He spat in Soto's face. But Soto only smiled. I'm the fucking fool! A harsh wind blew in from the east, and a half hour later, Ortiz finally died. His body lay upon a pile of wood, and Soto ordered the men to set it afire. In the morning, they held a vigil in the pouring rain. It lasted only 5 minutes. Soto did not attend. The rain swelled, and the captains called attention to their men. And at midday, they went off again, and the march continued. The 5th of May. It was the last day Soto had stood. In the morning, he fought his last battle. However, the night before, he went out alone to search for his kingdom. He went to the rivers of blood to fight the ghosts and demons of the past. And in the darkness, Soto followed the stars that no other man would dare to follow. The rain had stopped, but Soto pressed on. Blood kept pouring down from his nose to his chin. His muddied boots clanged the dirt. He brought no horse. He brought only his sword and his will. He was miles from his men, and throughout the twilight until noon, Soto pressed on. His mouth hung open. His eyes bleared and strained. Through the fog, a warm air had returned. He saw a trail of smoke from the east, and he followed it towards the end of the bend. Through the marsh, he saw a village. It was abandoned, but it had plenty food. There were rows of corn and beans and squash, all ready for harvest. Then Soto saw a dead possum with its tail severed and its entrails carved out in green pus of mold and excrement. And throughout its entire body swarmed a mass of maggots that were inhaling it whole. And Soto watched with insane pleasure. Then he went out to another hill. He heard a bird cry, and he looked in all directions. His gaze continued. He nodded and drifted in and out of sleep. Then a branch snapped. His eyes opened again, and his head swerved up and down. Images floated across his countenance, and he vomited out of his nose. Then Soto heard voices. Voices of the past, familiar, faint, and peculiar. They came in clear. He peered and saw a distant flame. It was bright and bulging. And amongst the fire stood his cohorts, Almagro and Francisco Pizarro. He watched and listened to their scheme as they delved their grand Cusco in half. He stared directly at their faces, but they never once looked at him. He shouted at them, begging them to respond, but they simply ignored him. Then other voices spoke. The brothers Pizarro, Juan, Gonzalo, and Hernando. And Soto watched them gathered around the table and listened to them speak the first holy language, the language of gold. This gold, the land is full of it. Finally, brothers. All rivers lead to gold. These Incas have it all. These Incas are bastards. We shall kill them all. We don't have to kill them all. We just have to live with them until they're conquered. All will be gained, my brothers. All rivers lead to gold. They've always have. Then all went quiet. Their mouths disappeared in the fog. Their faces vanished as well. Soto rushed forth and screamed their names. Francisco! Gonzalo! Hernando! Juan! But all the brothers had disappeared. Soto walked further. A queer light appeared from the river south, and a child ran out into the distance. The child's eyes were big as the moon, and Soto followed him for a quarter of a mile. The child approached the river and jumped in, and Soto merely watched. The child fell to the bottom and drowned, and the river turned red with blood. The blood came in many forms. The blood of all Soto had slain. The blood of the Inca and the Hussar and the Timucua and all the tribes who had no names. The blood of all that made the dream. And soon the screams came from deep within the river's heart. The shrills, the cries, the moans and the shouts. And the river went on and surged. And soon Soto's entire body submerged in blood. He stood, he smiled, he drank, and he savored. But then the river receded. And internally, Soto knew what that had meant. The kingdom was nigh. The kingdom was his, and his alone. It rained again, and Soto shouted and waited for all the gold in the world to fall from the sky. The rubies and emeralds, the silver and the turquoise. But there was no such thing. There was only rain, only water. The mud crept to his knees, and soon again the water turned to blood. And from within the red mist, Soto saw the royal court of Spain, with King Charles at the helm. They were all dressed in their finest garb, and their teeth were stained with wine. Soto shouted at them, but it did not matter. They ignored him and walked away, each looking solemn and perturbed. Soto rushed forth and swung his sword at them in rage, but they all disappeared. Blood rained again. Soto staggered. His entire face was splattered and ravaged. and the blood kept falling. Then Soto heard a thud. He saw heavy blocks of wood fall down from the sky. He followed the streams and shards, and below, a golden glow had emerged. And in that glow were a set of rotted wooden chests, and inside each were riches beyond Soto's wildest dreams. His fortune and glory. He approached the first chest and opened it. It was silver, whole and pure. He cradled it like a mother would do to a child. Then he found another chest filled with rubies. And he found another one not too far from that. Then he saw a much larger chest filled with gold. And he closed his eyes and cried. When he had awoken, the gold was still there. All the rubies and silver, sapphire and turquoise were still there in their rotted wooden chest. The rain stopped. Then Soto felt a sharp pain enter through his back. And suddenly, he couldn't move. A man came out from the bush, his head held down, his face sad. And Soto instantly knew. Sardina! Sardina! But Sardina did not reply. The man came closer. Soto hobbled and winced through the pain. We're here, Sardina! Sardina! The river leads to gold! Look at it! Look at it, you sad son of a bitch! Soto laughed. He laughed good and hard until he coughed. I can't believe it myself! Sardina kept walking. This is why we've suffered. We've won! We finally won! You shouldn't look so sad! Your dream has finally come! This dream! Our dream! We're right here! Behold our kingdom! Sardina! Sardina, you stupid bastard! Why are you walking away? The pain swelled and got stronger. Soto sweated throughout his entire body. Suddenly, he could not move. He writhed in pain with every step he took. And after 10 paces, Sardina had vanished. And Soto was alone again. He returned to the chests and gathered his fortunes. Another snap of a tree branch startled his ears and sounded like cannon fire. Soto turned from side to side. Then he heard another snap, clearer than before. Then Soto turned and saw the lady. She was dressed in the same white gown he remembered, and indeed, it was her. The lady of Cofitacheque. And Soto was overcome by the same palpable feelings of unstoppable lust. And he gazed for what felt like hours. My lady. She remained too far off in the distance. Again, her black hair flowed and whipped in the wind. My lady. Her gown fluttered. Her face grew stern. She was still young and bright and beautiful. My lady, come closer. I want to. The lady stood silent. Soto hobbled closer. They stood 10 feet from each other, and tears fell from her eyes. My lady, why? Why are you crying? Why are you crying, my lady?" Then the lady turned her back and ran, and Soto dashed right after her. He slashed through vines and shrubs and heard an ungodly squeal. Then the ground shook. He saw a black boar the size of a mature ram. It had tusks on either side of its face, and it snarled and ran. And Soto stared and smiled back. Soto crept forward with his sword in hand. Then the boar lunged after Soto with all its weight and force, and Soto fell to the ground. Its heavy tusks pierced through Soto's armor and ripped right into his knee. The cut was deep and hard, and Soto yelled and buckled. He struck the boar and slashed his sword across its face. The boar shrieked and spun wildly as a trail of blood dripped down to the mud. Soto fought through the pain and got back to his feet. The boar scampered back to all fours, but it was too late. And in all the pain and agony, Soto lifted his sword and plunged it straight down the boar's neck. He repeated it 7 times, each blow more powerful and methodical than the next. And after he finished, Soto clutched onto the boar's body and ran his hands through its intestines. The rain fell again. Soto returned to the chests, those of gold, silver, and sapphire, and of rubies and pearls. He wiped the sweat and tears off his face. Then he marched on. His armor was rusted and red, and blood continued to gush out from his knee. The rain fell harder. The river ran again. Soto stopped his stride. His mouth hung open. He saw 2 of the chests near the great oak. They seemed so very far away. He approached the chests, and the golden light glowed. Then a figure stepped forward from behind an oak tree. Soto halted and blinked several times. "Sardina, come back, huh?" But it wasn't. It was the lady. She stood in between the chests, and light radiated from her entire body. And in the fallen rain, they stared at each other long and hard again. Her eyes looked very sad. The lady cried. A light exploded from her body and blinded Soto for several seconds. Then the light disappeared, and Soto remained standing. His eyes twitched, but the lady was still crying. "Why are you crying, my lady?" "It's only blood. It's only..." He took one last step, and the lady shrieked. The shriek pierced and echoed through the land. And the lady and all the chest of Soto's fortune levitated and vanished in the air. The chest fell back to the ground, but the treasure was gone. There was only corn, beans, and straw. For an entire hour, Soto screamed and slashed away at the fallen rain. Then, complete darkness descended over the land. He swung one last final time, and he fell to the ground. Each captain remained in silence as the inevitable fell upon them. Soto was found the next day, and his men ushered him into a tent. The torches flickered in the moonlight, and the voices murmured in the dark. "Is he dead?" "No. He was stabbed. Who did it? I can't tell." Is he dead? No, he's fallen ill. They say he has a fever. Did he say anything today? No. Did he open his eyes? Yes, several times. He should have died a year ago. As days went on, Soto remained motionless in his tent. His face was gray and he barely breathed. But he wasn't dead yet. His men surrounded him. Some prayed, others merely waited. Another week passed. The priest gave him his last rites. 3 more days had passed. And finally, on the 21st of May, Soto died. The funeral commenced the following day. The captains gathered, and Moscoso spoke to each of them. I will give no speech. I will tell only what is necessary. Don Hernando has died. I am now in charge of the entrada. We shall bury him in the river. We shall bury him tonight. Balthasar sighed. It took him several more minutes to gain composure. Why are we burying him in the river? He asked. This was his request, said Moscoso. Those who believe he was mortal were absolutely correct. But to those who believed he was a child of the sun, let them still believe. Let them still wonder. That was his request. And so the night came, and the entire army gathered. They huddled around a wooden box, and the slaves carried the box and loaded it onto a raft. They lit their torches and rowed 5 leagues into the river. The monks hovered over the box, and they recited a dirge, and they gave Soto his last blessing. Then they lowered the box and wrapped it in chains. And they watched the box sink to the bottom. They said their prayers, but none of them had cried. And when the box sunk to the bottom, they rowed back to shore. The next day, Moscoso held the army at attention. The monks read aloud, the secretaries recorded, and Alvas and Rankau looked at each other with absolute disdain. But Moscoso repeated what was most important. The entrada was finally over. They would head back west to Mexico. New Spain, old Spain. Anywhere but here, Moscoso said. They marched and trudged and left the river for good. During the night, one soldier could not keep from crying. He cried and cried again. And he wailed and sobbed and cursed at God as he sat alone at a fire. Moscoso went over to the man. They talked, but not for long. Get up, Vicente. Thinking is not good for the soul. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, sir. I'm lost. We're all lost, said Moscoso. New Spain awaits us. You should focus on that. I don't know what's right or wrong anymore, said Vicente. You'll remember, said Moscoso. But we fought so hard. We gave up so much. We went so far. We did, Vicente. And we lost. But, sir, Then Moscoso looked at him for the final time. He sighed and pointed west. The dream is dead, son. It might take your entire life, but you have to accept it. It's done. I walked for another month. I was exhausted. I no longer knew anything. But still, I felt pain, guilt, and horror. I thought I had died many times, but I was still alive. And the river kept going. Soto was either dead or king by now. I didn't give a damn about him anymore. But still, his voice lingered in my mind. Dreams. Dreams, Sardina. Dreams. That's all they were. Horrible and evil dreams that caused so much pain. And the realization of it made me sadder. I spent my entire life searching for something that just wasn't there. But still, I wanted to find my real answer. The answer to why I'd gone so far for so long. The answer was beyond gold and beyond fortune. The answer was of truth and beauty. It was an answer of goodness and meaning. And when I found it, I knew I would finally feel whole. And my father's words still called to me. Go beyond, my son. At the river's end, you'll find your answer. So I did. I kept going. And I knew for certain that my father was right. I rested along a meadow of beautiful flowers and flowing streams of jumping fish. And from there, I saw another tribe. I waved my hands in peace. The tribe stared at me, but not a single one of them was frightened. Then a man approached and offered his hand. As he got closer, I realized he was not a native. His beard was thick and heavy, and he appeared very young. He was a Spaniard, dressed in tribal garb. He spoke to me in Spanish. I couldn't believe him at first, and it took me a long time to respond. What is your name? Sardina, I finally said. My name is Hector, said the man. Welcome, Sardina. What brings you here? I didn't answer. I didn't know how. I looked at him long and hard. He did the same. I shook his hand, but then I looked into his eyes. There was so much joy and peace and understanding. And he looked like the happiest man on the face of the earth. We welcome you, Sardina. I looked over to his tribe. He nodded to them, and they all nodded back with grace and certainty. Then Hector walked and pointed, and I followed him. Ahead was rich soil and a stretch of small houses. And at midday, I saw the children planting corn. In that instant, it reminded me of the people in the valley of the Corazones. They planted with their hands and pressed their feet upon the soil. And with each seed, they whispered a word and a prayer. Hector joined them and obliged me to do the same. We planted the entire field in less than an hour, and in all that time, we hadn't said a word. The sun died, and the younger men of the tribe gathered sticks for the night's fire. Hours later, I sat next to Hector and his wife, and we shared a meal. We shared a pipe and smoked. Then we talked for quite some time. "Where are you from, friend?" I wish I could remember. I forgot why I came. I did too, Sardina. But I finally found what I was looking for. And it's here. It's here. This is my wife. These are my people now. I am one of them. And I'm grateful. A few hours passed. After a long prayer, the rest of the tribe went to sleep. I stayed up with Hector, and we kept each other company along the fire. I looked at Hector's face, and when his wife carried his newborn and brought him to his side, I saw his face light up with great joy. And it was then that I realized who Hector really was. "These are fine people," I said. "They're my family," Hector said. "Your wife is beautiful." "Thank you. She's everything." "Your whole family. They're so beautiful. They're everything." And I knew when Hector said those words, he meant it. I saw it in his eyes. "You look tired, man," he said. "I'm very tired," I said. "What is it, Sardina? Why?" "I still haven't found it." "Found what?" "The river's end." "What's there to find?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "You don't know?" "No." "I see," Hector said. We stayed silent for a long time. Then I finally asked him, "Do you know where it is?" "I do," said Hector. "Will you show me, Hector?" "I will. It's not as far as you think. We'll go in the morning. I'll take you as far as I can." And in the morning, we trekked. I knew I had only a few hours left with him. I didn't count the miles. I just looked at the sun. Then, about midday, he paused and pointed his finger. And there it was, the river's end. The land had ceased. The river led to an endless sea. Then Hector looked at me and let out a sigh. And after another minute, he shook my hand and departed. And I was alone again. The sea was endless, just like the jungle, and just like the desert. It was empty and painful, and I closed my eyes. That voice that guided me soon drifted into the clouds, and when I looked up, I saw my father. I cried as he smiled down upon me, and for an hour I searched in tears It felt like an eternity. But I knew something was there, and I felt it deep within my soul. And there she was. She stood before the palms. I closed my eyes, thinking she was a dream, but she wasn't. She was the same woman I saw long ago. She stood still, and she looked right through me. But her eyes were soft. The fear was gone. There was only love. I stood frozen, and I gazed at her. For she, like the river, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She wasn't frightened. She neither quivered, nor did she move. She stood, and she stared, longingly, with ease. And when I looked again in her eyes, I saw the whole world. It was alive and beautiful. It was at peace, with no judgment. It was the world I once knew, the world I'd longed for and missed dearly. And I saw it all in her. We moved towards each other and kept our gaze. And when I saw her smile, I finally found what I had been searching for my entire life. And she was it. Then she came by my side and rested her head along my shoulder. I held her body, and she looked up. And when she did, I cried. At the river's end, all the thoughts were gone. All the pain, the misery, the strife, and the madness were washed away by the tide. And as the sun faded down, we looked at each other again. And each and every second, she restored my faith in everything. Then she dipped her head into my shoulders, rose up, and showed me once more all the glorious world that was all around me, that was here all this time, that I just could not see. She pointed to the trees, the river, and the upcoming orange moon. And we watched the sun die in the clouds. Then our eyes became one, and she held my hand.